Everybody, today we are in our first day of Unit 5, stepping into day 1, which is going to be the build up to war. And you're going to see the major focus of Unit 5 is the American Civil War, the build up to the war, and then the results of that war. I will warn you, this is one of my favorite time periods to talk about in history. And this is the time period that really got me loving history when I grew up. My dad's idea of summer vacations was always we'd go somewhere, but we'd also visit like a Civil War battlefield along the way. So it's something I'm very passionate about and that I enjoy studying very, very much. So if I go along with into videos, you'll understand why. So slavery compromises and the rise of Lincoln. One thing that you're going to realize is that our country, even though we are united as one country, in case you haven't figured this out, we are very, very different in a lot of ways. I know this personally. My wife is from Michigan. Actually, me and all of my siblings married people from the North, and things are very different between, Michigan and Virginia. You have some cultural things, different ways of talking, different types of foods, and that kind of thing. So in 2018, Colin Woodward did a book, and in it, he talked about the 11 cultural nations of the U.S. And I've provided a link there to you that goes through and actually breaks down what are the characteristics of each of these areas. But you can see he kind of split up the country into these different regions, even going into including part of Mexico and Canada in this as well. If you look at Bedford County on this map, it is very, very difficult to see on there, but we are actually part of the greater Appalachia region. So I encourage you to go on there and check that out. And the reason that I bring that up is because you're going to see building up to the Civil War, even though slavery is going to really be the primary driving factor behind that, you're going to see sectionalism also plays a huge part in that you have the country that develops in very, very different ways. And even today, if you look at the country is very, very different based on where you go in that. Downtown Los Angeles is going to look a whole lot different than downtown Helena, Montana does, and that kind of thing. So just remember that as we talk about this, that you're going to have a nation, again, E pluribus unum is our slogan, which means out of many one, and really promotes that unity. But we are a very, very different country in many, many ways based on where you go. So sectional tensions. What are the big tensions that you're going to see? You're going to see in 4 areas. 1, slavery. Of course, we have mentioned slavery before as being this reoccurring tension, and you're going to see that slavery actually plays a part in a lot of these other tensions as well. Northern opposition to slavery. Of course, that caused tension between North and South. And again, remember when we talk about Northern opposition to slavery, that it's only about 10% of Northern population that cares that strongly about abolition. But generally, you're going to find more anti-slavery people in the North. Also, the slave revolts that happen, that causes tension. And again, we talked about that, how that was a constant concern between the North and the South. 2, Western expansion. Again, as we expand out to the West, we just talked about manifest destiny and gaining all that land. That is going to cause a lot of tension between the North and the South as well, over whether or not these new areas would be free or slave, and trying to keep that balance of power in the country. 3, states' rights. Debates over the power of the federal government and the nature of the union. Again, what is the power of the federal government? How much power does the federal government have over the states? And then when we talk about the nature of the union, are we this loose confederation of states altogether, or are we truly united as one? Once you get in the United States, you stay, you can't leave. And with states' rights, that starts bringing in things like nullification, which had been brought up in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions that we talked about previously. And then 4, economic interests. Again, the North favored tariffs. The South did not like tariffs because of the difference in the economy, and because the South didn't like tariffs because it made their goods more expensive when they weren't producing in the South the same way that the North was producing. So all of these things are going to be things that lead to tensions between the North and South and really help push us in that direction of a civil war. So consequences of the Mexican-American War, of course, there had been a military disaster for Mexico. You had the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which in that recognized the Rio Grande as the southern border of Texas and where we acquired the Mexican cession. Also, remember we talked about the Wilmot Proviso, which was the proposal to forbid slavery. That would be defeated, but then again, that would show some of the intentions of some of the northern senators in that time to want to try to get rid of slavery. During this time period that we're talking about, you're going to see California grows. January of 1848, you would see that gold would be discovered in slavery. By May of that year, word had leaked out and settlers start pouring into California. And then in December of that year, President Polk would confirm gold in California. So by 1849, you have 80,000 49ers arriving in California. So if you've ever wondered why the San Francisco 49ers are called that, because in 1849, you have a ton of people going into California to try to hopefully strike rich by finding gold. So the reason this is important is because quickly by November of 1849, by the end of that year, California actually has enough people to become a state. They would ratify a state constitution. In that, they would prohibit slavery and apply for statehood. Again, remember that the people coming out to California, they're coming for gold. They're not really coming to do large-scale farming, so they really don't have a use for slavery in California. Now, admitting California as a free state would cause an imbalance in the number of free and slave states. So how would the South respond to that? Robert Toombs from Georgia, he would say, if you seek to drive us from territories of California and New Mexico, I am for disunion. So you see already early talks of splitting up the country. Other Southerners hoped to block the admission of California because, again, of that fear over what would happen to the institution of slavery if you did have an imbalance between the North and the South states. Now, congressional debate over this, you're going to see John C. Calhoun, again, the old vice president of Andrew Jackson. John C. Calhoun, on his deathbed, would put forth some of his own views. On his deathbed, he would assert the right of states to secede from the Union. Again, this is something we've heard mentioned many times in American history, starting with the New England states and then ending up with Southern states. He proposes a constitutional amendment to balance political power of the North and the South by creating a dual presidency. So basically, you'd have a Northern and a Southern president, which would be very interesting. And states that Congress did not have the power to regulate slavery in the territory. Basically, he states that basically based off the idea that slaves are property and that Congress cannot regulate a person's property. You will see that some Southerners did agree with this whole concept I'm going to mention next, but Northern Democrats and moderate Southerners favored extending the Missouri Compromise line. Remember, that original line only went through the Louisiana Purchase, and some people said, hey, let's extend it all the way out to the Pacific Ocean. Now, that causes an issue because California would be split in half by that line. Now, in 1848, you're going to have Lewis Cass. He proposes the idea of using popular sovereignty, which meant that the people in the territories would get to decide whether or not they wanted to be slave or free. Now, this is a good idea in principle, but the problem that it would cause is, again, you're putting it kind of up to the whims of people. If a state's going to be slave or free, that could lead to fighting in a region. But more importantly, you're going to have people in Congress worried, well, what if the number of free and slave states becomes very, very off in doing that? So again, that concern over the balance of free and slave states. So that's going to get us to the Compromise of 1850. President Millard Fillmore, he becomes president. Old Zachary Taylor had died in office. Clay, a Whig, Winchester, a Whig, or Webster, a Whig, and Douglas, a Democrat, all pushed for the passage of 5 laws to appease both sides. So again, Henry Clay is the great compromiser, comes in and helps negotiate this compromise, and it would be known as the Compromise of 1850. I put here in bold some of the major things in it that would be kind of controversial. One is the new fugitive slave law. The South really had enough of slaves escaping to the North, so they wanted a fugitive slave law with more teeth in it, and that would be part of this compromise, which basically said, hey, Southerners if slaves escape to the North, they have to be returned. It also authorized people to go into the North to try to find their escaped slaves. California would be admitted as a free state. The boundary disputes between New Mexico and Texas, those would be solved in favor of New Mexico. You would see the end of the slave in D.C. Again, this would be a major victory for abolition people because D.C. could kind of have become the hotbed of people being taken out of the North, African Americans being taken out of the North into D.C. and thrown into slavery. And then it would divide the Utah and New Mexico territories and allow them to use popular sovereignty in New Mexico and Utah. So basically, it's allowing these territories in Utah and New Mexico to use popular sovereignty to decide if they wanted slavery. So again, this is the compromise that would work out. I think on a surface level that really this compromise would work out better for the North. If you think about New Mexico and Utah, those areas, you don't have a lot of wide-scale farming there, so there's not a lot of use for slaves. So really, you could say it's a victory for the abolition side because they would look at it and say, well, those places don't really have a use for slaves. So yeah, we'll leave it up to popular sovereignty because they felt like those areas probably would not vote in favor of slavery. So that's Compromise of 1850. Now, as I said, this fugitive slave law, this would be a big loss for abolitionists in this compromise of 1850. Abolitionists, of course, did not want to return slaves to the South. You would actually see this would lead to bloodshed in 1851 in Pennsylvania when 20 African Americans would fire on slave catchers, killing 2 of them. Uncle Tom's Cabin, when that is published, which we'll talk more about, that would magnify opposition to this as well. You will see personal liberty laws pass based to ensure the legal rights of residents, including the accused fugitives in the North. So this was one way they tried to circumvent this fugitive slave law was saying, hey, we have personal liberty laws that are in place that ensure these people freedom. And of course, you would see the Underground Railroad would continue to operate as well to smuggle escaped slaves into the North and Canada. So as I said, you would have Uncle Tom's Cabin come out during this time, as well as some other books that would add to the tension over slavery. Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, it told the fictional story of a brutal slave owner and his slave Tom. We have mentioned this book before, but again, like I said, this book did cause a lot of tension between the North and the South, so much so that when Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe during the Civil War, it is rumored that he said to her, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war." Also, you'd have in 1857 the book called Impending Crisis of the South, where Hinton Helper, he would use statistics to demonstrate how slavery hurt the South's economy. Again, this is something that I mentioned before as a way that the anti-slavery people would go after and try to appeal to Southerners by saying, hey, look how much slavery hurts your economy and will eventually lead to devastation for it. And then you'll have George Fitzhugh, who writes many books, 2 of the most popular ones being Sociology of the South and Cannibals All. In these books, he would defend slavery and attack the wage system in the North as worse than slavery. So I've also mentioned this as well. These books would kind of be a rebuttal to other books that were against slavery. But really, you're going to see a lot of times that in the South, they did compare slavery to the wage system of labor in the North and said, look, slavery is no worse than the system that you have in the North, where people live in poverty and work in factories. So that leads us to the election of 1852. You're going to see the Whigs would nominate General Winfield Scott as their candidate, and the Democrats would select Franklin Pierce. Again, you'll see a lot of internal division within the parties over slavery. And again, we're still at the Democratic and the Whig parties now. Pierce would win as he appears to be a compromise candidate between the North and the South. And you're going to see these elections in 1850 all very, very similar. Again, a lot of division over slavery, a lot of division between North and South. But if you look at this election here, Pierce, because he does appear to be that compromise candidate, would get a lot of support. Now, President Franklin Pierce, he'd have the nickname Handsome Franklin because a lot of people considered him very good looking during this time. And during his time, he would have an expansionist foreign policy. He would negotiate some commercial treaties with Japan. He would send James Gadsden to negotiate the Gadsden Purchase in New Mexico and Arizona, which you can see on the map there is that bottom territory. And at that time, that land was seen very important as a potential route for a transcontinental railroad. The U.S. would try to seize Cuba from Spain, but it ends up not working out. The Austin Manifesto of 1854 states that the U.S. would be justified in seizing Cuba, but at this point, we would not do that. We'll talk about Cuba later down the road and what exactly plays out in Cuba, but just know for a while that the U.S. did have a lot of interest in Cuba. Got a funny video here for you from Late Night with Jimmy Fallon. Encourage you to check out this video. It is pretty funny about the Gadsden Purchase. So railroads, territory, and expansion. You're going to see that Senator Stephen Douglas would devise a plan for building a railroad and promoting Western expansion during this time. Really, again, like I said, there would be a big fight over the Transcontinental Railroad and what exact path that it would be. Stephen Douglas, being from Illinois, he saw a lot of benefit in Chicago being a terminus of the Transcontinental Railroad. It would help the value of his own real estate holdings, but also bring more wealth to Chicago. So to appease Northerners and Southerners, Douglas would introduce a bill to divide the Kansas and Nebraska territory and allow the territories to vote on the status of slavery. And the reason that he did this is because for the Transcontinental Railroad to actually go through these territories, they needed to be actual territories that were becoming states for the Transcontinental Railroad to go through. So that's why he pushes so hard for this. Now, Stephen Douglas knew that this bill was going to be problematic. In fact, he said this bill will raise a hell of a storm, and that is exactly what it would do. That leads us to the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. And you'll see that these territories have been largely ignored because of the political ramifications and the Missouri Compromise. If you remember the Missouri Compromise line, both of these territories were above that line, so technically both of these territories should be free. A lot of people, though, from the Ohio River Valley and the Upper South had hoped to migrate into these territories and to settle them. So what the Kansas-Nebraska Act would do is another one of these compromise bills. We talked about the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1850. It would repeal the Missouri Compromise line and allow these areas to use popular sovereignty and form two territories known as the Nebraska and Kansas Territory. And you're going to see that this sets off a firestorm. So what happens is Kansas is the first of the states to vote on whether or not that they wanted slavery there. Missouri Senator David R. Atchison, he would begin sending residents to Kansas to vote in the election determining the slave and free status of Kansas. And you're going to see both sides do this on a large scale to try to tip the balance and to try to get the state to either be pro-slave or free. They were telling residents, hey, go there and vote in this election. Now, the term Bleeding Kansas would be coined by Horace Greeley in 1856 because you would have a large amount of fighting in Kansas between pro-slavery advocates and between abolitionists there. Again, they would send their forces there to try to mobilize the vote. The New England Immigrant Aid Company would actually paid for the transportation of anti-slavery people to Kansas. Border ruffians, as they were known, were pro-slavery Missourians. They would cross the border and try to create their own pro-slavery legislature in Kansas. The anti-slavery settlers would refuse to recognize that government. So basically, you have both sides here rushing into Kansas because of how much weight they held for this Kansas territory and what was going to happen with it. Abolitionist John Brown and his militia would arrive. They would murder and mutilate 5 pro-slavery settlers in what is known as the Potawatomi Massacre. And you're going to see the President Pierce during this time. He basically refuses to do anything to keep in order in Kansas, and almost 200 people die as a result of the conflicts there. So Bleeding Kansas really does turn into this mess of violence over these votes and whether or not Missouri or Kansas would be pro-slave and pro-free. And again, I think a lot of that has to do with, again, Kansas being bordered by Missouri, but also with Missouri, which was a slave state, but also being in such close proximity to free states, you kind of had this powder keg waiting to happen. And in many ways, you can say this is kind of the precursor to the Civil War, which would happen in about 5 years. Now, during this time, you are going to see the death of the second party system. The Kansas-Nebraska Act basically destroys the Whig Party and nearly kills the Democratic Party. The Northern Whigs and the anti-Nebraska Democrats would join with the Free Soilers and abolitionists to create the Republican Party. And this is the Republican Party that we know of today in 1854. The Republicans, their whole goal would be to ban slavery in the territories and condemn slavery, but not necessarily push to end slavery. Because it drove down wages of working conditions for whites and degraded the dignity of manual labor. You would see that the Republicans would face competition from the Know Nothing Party, who were anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic during this time. As far as the Democratic Party is concerned, you're going to see the Democrats become the primary party, but the Democratic Party is going to be very split between the North and the South and very split over the issue of slavery, which eventually is going to lead to the Republican Party winning eventually. That's a little bit of foreshadowing there for you. This violence in Kansas would actually end up on the Senate floor as well. I put a video there that explains to you the Brooks-Sumner caning accident, or incident, I should say. Representative, though, Preston Brooks, he would end up caning Senator Charles Sumner. Senator Charles Sumner, who is an abolitionist, got up and gave this very passionate speech against slavery. In that speech, though, he would criticize slave owners and basically call them like pimps of the slaves, and say some very, very harsh things. Specifically, he would single out Preston Brooks' uncle, Andrew Butler, in this speech. Brooks is enraged. What does he do the next day? He marches into the Senate with his cane, basically says, hey, Sumner, you have offended my family's honor, and you're going to pay for that. Senator Charles Sumner was sitting in his seat, which at that time, the Senate floor, the desks were actually bolted to the floor, and he starts beating Charles Sumner over the head with this cane. Now, Charles Sumner, you got to understand, not the most liked guy in the Senate, which is why you see in this picture here, some people in the back are laughing as this happened. Preston Brooks would basically beat him until his cane broke. Sumner would have several head injuries during this time. He would eventually go off to Europe for a little bit and almost be seen as like a martyr for the abolitionist side here. Even though he didn't die, a lot of people saw him in that way. But again, this shows that building tension between the North and the South that actually is going to go out and happen on the Senate floor there. With this, Brooks would be censured by the Senate, but wouldn't face any real punishment for this. You're going to see a lot of Southerners actually celebrated him, sent him canes, a lot of them inscribed with "hit him again." Again, showing that tension between North and the South. That gets us to the election of 1856. The Republicans would nominate Colonel John C. Fremont. Their platform, of course, denounces the Kansas-Nebraska Act, wants to prohibit slavery in the territories, as well as federal subsidies for the Transcontinental Railroad. The American Party, a new party, they would nominate former President Millard Fillmore, although half the party didn't really like him because he wasn't universally liked in the North or the South. You will see that most of the Know Nothing Party actually go on to support the Republicans because of the Republicans' financial view on banning foreign immigrants and high tariffs on foreign manufacturers. And the Democrats would nominate James Buchanan, who is a bachelor. That's notable in history because you don't see that very often with presidents, a Pennsylvanian who supported the South. So in a lot of ways, you're going to see that James Buchanan is kind of the best of the compromise candidates because he's from the North, but he is pro-Southern or sympathetic to the Southern causes. So the result of the election, Buchanan wins. And again, this marks the notation of the end of the Whig Party. The Whig Party, really, you're going to see the Republicans and the Democrats become the major party there. And those still the major parties today as well. Also in 1856, you're going to have a landmark decision happen, which again leads to more tension between the North and the South, and this would be the Dred Scott decision. The Supreme Court, led by the old Andrew Jackson nominee Roger B. Taney, declares that both free and slave blacks could not be citizens of the country. And he bases that on two things. He says Congress couldn't deny Southern citizens the right to take their slave property into territories due to the Fifth Amendment due process clause, and two, Congress did not give to territorial governments powers it did not have. So basically he's saying Congress can't give powers to territorial governments to vote on slavery because they didn't have that power as a territory to actually be able to do that. And the reason this case got brought to the Supreme Court is that Dred Scott had been part in a slave. He'd been owned as a slave. His family would move to an area where there was freedom, and he thought that he should give freedom. And the Supreme Court would disagree with him on that. Now, the practical side of this case, again, besides saying that African Americans could not be citizens of the United States, really what this does is this legalizes slavery throughout the entire country, because it says the federal government has no power to legislate slavery anywhere in the country. So remember all those slave compromises that we talked about? Basically, they're all out the window now because now slavery can exist anywhere within the country. The Republicans, of course, would reject this decision. Buchanan would decide to side with the pro-slavery legislature in Kansas. Frederick Douglass would break with the president and his Democratic Party at the time, or no, Stephen Douglas would break with the president and his party and would block the actual admission of Kansas as a state. So again, more attention here. This is only adding fuel to the fire and building up to the Civil War. Now, this brings us to the rise of Lincoln. Lincoln believed that slavery should be allowed to continue in the states where it already existed, but that it should not be expanded into the territories. And he would give this famous speech in it, again, drawing from biblical allusions. He would say, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I do believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. It will become all one thing or all the other." And you can say he's really predicting what is going to happen in the future of the country. And this is something that Jefferson had been warning about for a long time as well during his lifetime. So, during the 1858 Senate run race in Illinois, Lincoln would run against Democrat Stephen Douglas. They would have a series of very well and very publicized debates, the Lincoln-Douglas debate, 7 debates. Douglas would in it declare his support for white supremacy, while Lincoln advocated economic opportunity for free blacks, but not political equality. You're going to see that's going to take something that's going to take Lincoln a little bit a while to get to that point in his life. But again, Lincoln will lose this election, but it really does thrust him into the spotlight as far as the Republican Party goes, and that's why he is going to be their candidate in the next election, because he does so well in these debates. So during this time, also, you're going to have, in 1859, the John Brown raid here in Virginia. And I want you to watch this video here of Harper's Ferry. It's a very short video of Harper's Ferry in what is now West Virginia. Check that video out. But you're going to see the rise of radicals with John Brown's raid. You're going to have they're known as the fire eaters. These are going to be these people that start promoting Southern secession, while moderates, such as the future president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, they said, hey, let's just win political commitments to slavery and not go down this road to secession. So in response, John Brown will lead a raid on the federal arsenal that was in Harper's Ferry, Virginia at that time. And his hope was to raid this arsenal, get all the guns from it, and start arming slaves and start a slave rebellion in the South. Remember, John Brown is the one that had led that Potawatomi massacre in Kansas in response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Republicans would disagree with Brown, while Democrats state that Brown is simply a reflection of Republican policies. And we see this in politics even today. You generally take the fringe of each side and you try to pin that on your opponent, and that is exactly what is going to happen with John Brown's raid. Now, John Brown's raid would be quickly put down. Actually, you would see Robert E. Lee, future Confederate General Jeb Stuart, Stonewall Jackson would all be part of the Virginia force that would go to put down John's raid. Again, it would be ended very, very quickly, and he was not successful at all in what he was trying to do. Virginia would charge Brown, of course, with treason, and he would be hanged. Now, in the North, some people viewed him in a very positive light. Henry David Thoreau called Brown an angel of light. And as I say, you do have some future Confederate leaders here from Virginia who would take part in this. In fact, I have on here, I'm not going to read it all to you, but this is Stonewall Jackson's account of the execution of John Brown in describing everything that went on in that. So that leads us to the election of 1860. The Democrats would be torn between North and South and nominate actually 2 candidates, Stephen Douglas and John C. Breckinridge. You can tell right off the top that is not going to work out well. If you are trying to run, you having your political party run 2 candidates usually means that your political party is not going to win. The Republicans would pick Lincoln. Again, he was seen as a moderate. He wasn't at the far side that said, hey, let's eliminate slavery across the whole country. They felt like that they could get more support behind him because he was more of a moderate, saying, hey, I'm not going to mess with slavery. We just don't want slavery to expand into other places. The Constitutional Union Party, made up by a lot of old Whigs, they would nominate John Bell. And you can see here what happens in the election because of that split within the Democratic Party. Again, if you took the numbers of the Democratic Party here and mixed them together, the Democratic Party would have won this election. But because of the split within their party, that allows Lincoln to easily win the election. So again, Because of this election, the split in the Democrats, that allows Lincoln to win. And you're going to see that it sets off all kinds of panic bells in the South and as the country as a whole, as the Republican Party, a relatively new party, now takes over the presidency. And everybody knows the Republican Party's view on slavery. So when you're talking about factors of bringing the Civil War, what cause do you believe is most important? This is something that I usually poll my classes on. That if really you just kind of look through these causes and think about these, you will notice there are some notable things that I didn't put in here with it, and that's just listing like slavery. I've incorporated that as several of these causes. So just look at those and just think about those on your own. So, and with this, you're going to be doing an activity here. Don't necessarily follow these instructions. Look at the instructions that I have put on Canvas for you, because this is back when I would do this in class as a group. So hope you can see all these causes building up to the Civil War. And next class, we're going to be jumping into, again, with Lincoln becoming president and the series of events that's going to start, as well as we get to the American Civil War. So hope you have a fantastic day.